Hello and welcome to Trades Tuesday. I'm digital content producer Bill Pavlak. Today we've got a program for you about dinner. Call it Made for Dinner. We're not really going to talk too much about table manners and eating and so forth. We're going to talk about all the material culture that would come together in a gentry dining room. We're also going to consider the enslaved people that would be working all day long to set up a table for dinner and move things about, keep them clean and so forth. And of course we'll talk about food. But first, we need a place to sit to have this panel discussion. Right beside me is a beautiful mahogany table. I'm normally a cabinet maker here at Colonial Williamsburg, joined by one of our apprentice cabinet makers who made this table, and he'll tell you all about it.
Yeah, hello. My name is John Peeler. As Bill said, I'm an apprentice cabinet maker here at Colonial Williamsburg, and this mahogany drop leaf dining table is my work. It is a six-legged table, four of which move, because this table is not in its final state right now. Dining tables from this time period, they expand. They are drop leaf, and so as you'll see here in a moment, a mahogany table like this is an expensive thing that would be found in a gentry home, but that doesn't mean that they have a large central dining table in their dining room. This would be, when not used for dining, would be off to the side along with many other pieces of furniture. But to use it, of course, we need to expand this table. So let's give that a shot there, Bill.
Yeah, because it doesn't look like a comfortable place to sit at the moment.
Not right now. So as we lift up the drop leaves, we'll swing out the legs here and actually create a surface 3 times as large now and ready for use as a dining table.
And I think we could probably comfortably get, 6 people at this without having legs of the table mixed up with your own legs.
Right, exactly. This is a close look here. What I have here, an example woodworking joint of what is making that swinging leg possible. It's what we call a knuckle joint here today, but one side would be affixed to the table, and then the other side affixed to that swinging leg. Of course, on my table I have 4 of these, but this makes it possible. It's essentially a wooden hinge. Now we do have a quick video for you on the making of the leg to a dining table just like mine here.
Hi, I'm Bill Pavlak, Master Cabinet Maker here at Colonial Williamsburg. Today my colleagues and I are going to talk to you about the process we use to make a turned table leg like the one right here on a table that one of the fellows has been making. The way we go about this work is really informed by a leg similar to this one that our archaeologists unearthed out in the stream silt below the Anthony Hay cabinet shop here about 60 years ago. This is a leg that our predecessors over 200 years ago started making. Something went amiss and they threw it out. And so trapped within the surfaces of that are clues as to their process. So we're going to walk you through how they got something like this in the first place and then where we would take that to end up here.
Hello, I'm Jeremy Tritchler. I am an apprentice cabinet maker here, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to do some of the rough work of preparing one of these table legs for turning it on the lathe. First of all, we're going to start out with a very square blank, and then we're going to cut away some large wedges of materials. Giving us a leg that's very square looking, but looks about like what we want it to be. I'll then come in with a chisel and begin to round and shape some of the curve of the top of the foot here. Take a draw knife to start flattening up some of the work from the saw cuts, and then start cutting away the corners of that leg in preparation for turning it on the lathe. It's also during the draw knifing phase on the original leg where some fibers were blown out, and which probably led to it being thrown out and not used for the finished piece in the first place.
I'm John Peeler. I'm an apprentice here in the Hay Cabinet Shop, and I'm here at our treadle lathe, a very important tool for getting this leg turned and ready to go on the table. The first step on the leg is to turn the pommel where the square post at the top of the leg transitions into the round part that's turned on the lathe. With the pommel done, the next step is to use the roughing gouge to start to remove a lot of the material on the leg barrel and start bringing it down to actually round. I'm now going to go back to the skew chisel and get a much finer surface on the part that we roughed out with the roughing gouge. The last step to do after I've got the barrel of the leg, most of the leg, done is to come down here to the foot. Now this foot is offset turned, so I've actually changed the point where the lathe engages into the piece of wood so that the foot will come out not in the same axis as the leg, but offset from it.
Once John was done turning the foot on the lathe, he needed to create a little transition between the two turnings. Do that 6 times and you have enough legs for a nice drop leaf dining table like this. We don't think about that very often when we sit down to dinner, but there's a lot of work that goes into all of this. That stream that runs under the shop doesn't help us turn our lathe. It never would have in the 18th century, but fortunately for us, it did preserve this artifact that gave us a lot of insight in how our predecessors went about doing this work. Welcome back. We've met our cabinet makers. Now we've got our table up and we've got some company. So I think we'll go around the table and have our panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Janice Kennedy. I'm currently the supervisor at the Peyton Randolph property here in Colonial Williamsburg.
Good day. I'm Frank Clark. I'm the master of historic Foodways here at Colonial Williamsburg.
Hi, my name is George Cloyed. I'm the master silversmith here at Colonial Williamsburg.
So we've heard about how the furnishings in a dining room can be fairly dynamic. We're going to move a table out for dinner. We're going to move all the chairs around it. We're going to take that away eventually and move other things here and there. Most of that work, I imagine, in a gentry home would have been done by enslaved servants. Janice, can you tell us about those people?
Well, over half the town at the time that we're talking about is African, and 52.4% are those who are African and enslaved. And so in all these spaces and places, you would have the enslaved who are taking the room apart, setting the room up, putting it to rest, arranging it to accommodate the activity that's going to take place there. So they're the ones that are going to be paying attention to the lighting and making sure that the room is free of cobwebs and dust and the fireplaces are right and all the accoutrements that they need are there. Everything that's going to make that event a success, they're going to be responsible for, every little detail.
How many people typically would be, involved in setting a room for dinner? I guess it depends on.
It just depends on who you have, because you have to use who you have.
Right.
Some people have to do 3 or 4 jobs, but at the Randolph property, you've got about 28 enslaved individuals there, and he can also bring in more if he needs it. So you've got children who are part of the process. They're doing light work, but the women and men that are there are going to be the ones that really set things up. You could have waiting men, waiting boys, waiting women as well, as far as a butler. And sometimes we find footmen who would be there. So at least 5 to 6 individuals would be there helping us set it up.
We'll get to what's going on once the meal actually starts in a bit. But is somebody, because there's a lot going on at once eventually, is one of the enslaved servants going to be sort of in charge of the others?
You're going to have someone who's the overseer, who's going to make sure that every detail is being taken care of, instructing people how to move, where to place things, what they need. So there's always one person that's kind of the lookout person.
So a lot of skill and knowledge there, and probably cool under pressure, I imagine.
You need that kind of personality for sure.
Yeah. So George, they're going to obviously be setting out silver of various kinds. What do we expect to find in a gentry dining room in the 18th century as far as silver?
In the 18th century, you're probably going to find some punch equipage. You'll probably find tea equipage. You'll find lots of spoons. Even unless you're amongst the most well-to-do, you might not have all silverware. You might have knives and forks made of steel and bone, and the middle class would have pewter spoons, but the upper class and the upper middle class would have silver spoons, as well as other silver accoutrements, salt cellars, salt shovels, things of that sort.
So I imagine a fair amount of specialized equipment for serving particular dishes as the century goes on.
As the century goes on, you get more and more specific items. Things like the fish trowel that we're going to demonstrate how it was made and used in the 18th century.
Well, your staff, we've put together a video of making a fish trowel, so should we take a look at that now?
Yeah, let me just say that the silversmiths involved here are Bobbie Saye, a journeyman silversmith, Megan Cantwell, our apprentice, and although she's not pictured here, our other journeyman, Chris Hodges-Strum, there's a piece in here that she made.
Hello, my name's Bobbie Saye, silversmiths here at Colonial Williamsburg. I've been here about 16 years. We're going to talk about serving utensils today. And this particular serving utensil is called a fish trowel. About 1760s, they start becoming very popular. And when fish is starting to become served more a white fish, so fried or poached fish, you have that open work here to be able to drain the fish as you're serving it. So the trowel we're talking about today is this particular piece, the blade with a cast handle soldered onto it. Sometimes though you might have a handle that is cast with wooden component or maybe an ivory component. And sometimes you might just have a trowel that's one piece. To make a fish server, we will start with an ingot. And that ingot then becomes hammered into sheet metal. And here is a piece that is in the process of being hammered. And once that's thin enough, we take a sharp steel tool called a scribe and scratch a permanent design on there. So you drill a hole, thread a saw blade through the hole, and then cut out those internal areas. And here you can see our apprentice, Megan Cantwell, saw piercing the designs into the trowel. Then where we've scribed also some of the decorative aspect, then that's engraved in, taking a sharp tool called a graver or a burin and cutting that design in deeper. Also, we have, in this case, a cast handle, and we'll make a pattern out of wood or pewter, send that pattern down to the foundry, and they can press it into a sand mold and then pour the silver into the impression. And then there's a lot of filing, and sometimes we have a process called chasing where we lose some of the design in the casting process, and so you can kind of hammer in that design with wedge-shaped tools and make it sharper again. Once you are finished cleaning up the handle and the blade, these pieces can be silver soldered, then polished up one more time, and then you have a nice serving utensil that you can serve your guests fried or poached fish.
All right, so it's a beautiful fish trowel, but when we have a fish trowel, we probably need some fish. Right? And so Frank, before we get into the particulars of poaching a fish, tell us a little bit about dinner. I mean, when are we eating dinner in the 18th century?
Dinner is really the main meal of the day in the 18th century. It will occur at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it may last for 2 to 3 hours, depending on the guests and what kind of interesting conversations they provide and what kind of business is being conducted at the table as well. At the governor's palace, it's always about the politics involved. So it is the meal that you actually cook and really have a set time for. The other meals, the supper that evening and the breakfast in the morning, are typically made up of leftovers from that dinner meal. So normally we cook one big meal each day, serve it 3 times.
It's how much, I mean, it's not just one meat, right? I mean, there's quite a bit that goes into that main meal.
Absolutely. You should have probably one of all the main meat groups in each course. So beef or some red meat animal, pork or lamb, a fowl, a fish, all those kinds of things, and prepared in a variety of different ways. So that shows off the skills of your cooks.
Okay, and no doubt also the size of your purse as well, I imagine.
Absolutely.
So tell us about, we've got to put a video together of you and your staff poaching a fish. We need to set that up before we see it.
Well, you know, fish, we're on a great location for that. A peninsula between two rivers here, so we have lots of seafood readily available to us in Williamsburg, and often when you bought it at market, it was alive in a barrel of water, and you would bring a bucket of water to get your live fish and bring it back home. Once you get it to the governor's palace, that's when the work of the servants and slave folks who are there on the property is going to begin. Initially in the scullery with the scaling and gutting of the fish.
And before we roll the video, just a reminder to everyone watching along, thanks for joining us. Please feel free to send in questions for all of us, and we'll be happy to start answering those pretty soon. But before then, let's take a look at this video.
Welcome to the Governor's Palace Kitchen. I'm Frank Clark, the master of historic Foodways, and today we're going to be preparing a fish for the governor's table. We have a lovely puppy drum here, which is going to be a fish that'll come up into the bay at certain times of the year, and we're going to poach him using the governor's lovely fish kettle. But the first step in this process will be to scale and gut our fish. For that, we're going to go next door to the scullery for the scullions to do that.
Hello there, I am Dominique Marsh. I'm an apprentice here for Foodways. How you scale a fish is you are going to take the back of a knife and you are going to go against the way that fishes are swimming. So you just take it and you go forward and continue to get all of these scales off. The scullery is where you are going to be doing the preparation work for anything that is going to the kitchen to be prepared for their food. We do the gutting, the scaling, we pluck the feathers out of animals as well as skin them. I think? Nope, I have a little bit more. We have just finished scaling the fish, so what we're going to do is we are going to go under these two little fins where the head actually becomes the body, gut it, cut all the way down, and take out everything that's inside of it. All right, and now that we've cleaned out all of the dried up blood that was on the back, we are going to take it to the master chef, and we are going to be cooking up this large fish we have here.
Poaching is a very simple cooking technique, but it requires one thing, a fish kettle, a poacher. And this is actually a very expensive piece of equipment here, made entirely of copper and tin, and is going to be quite costly. The governor has two of them. So we're going to start by making what's known as a core bouillon. This is going to be the sauce which this fish is going to steam in. We've got a little bit of white wine we're going to add in there. We've got some fish stock that we made previously, and we're going to put some of that into our kettle. We're going to add in a bit of lemon juice to that mixture. We want to get a nice flavor into this stock, because that flavor is going to end up in our fish as it steams slowly here in the fish kettle. I've got a little bit of garlic we're going to add to all that so that our getting some nice aromatics in our mixture. Got a nice bundle of sweet herbs out of our garden here. In this pile we have some sage, a little bit of thyme, a bit of fennel, and some chives that we put together here. We're just going to season up this core bouillon with a bit of salt and pepper. So now we're going to put the fish into the poaching liquid, the core bouillon, and then put that onto the fire. This is a super simple process. We're just going to bring this up to a boil and let it sit for a few minutes in there and stew in its own juices. Done very nicely. This last step of the process, the plating and garnishing of the fish, will take place in the little middle room at the governor's palace, done by the cook as right before the dish goes to the table. The carving and serving of our fish will take place by the guests at the table, and this will be part of the first course, known as a remove. After everybody's served some of the fish, it will be removed and replaced with another dish, a heavy joint of meat, typically a ham or a leg of lamb or something like that.
All right, so Frank, today you're training people to do this work. In the 18th century, do you have professional chefs working in a kitchen like the Palace Kitchen, or is it somebody else?
Occasionally. It depends on the governor. The governor is responsible for paying for their own lifestyle and their own household expenses. So each governor is going to be a little different depending on their finances and how much they want to spend on that kind of thing. The last two royal governors, the wealthiest and most important royal governors to arrive in Virginia, did bring professionally trained cooks from Europe with them. A Frenchman in the case of Lord Dunmore and an Englishman in the case of Governor Botetourt. And they both also brought undercooks with them as well. But other than those four individuals, pretty much everybody else in the kitchen was enslaved. There was one brief period during one of the governor's tenures where the wife of a governor, where the wife of one of the gardeners was hired as a cook. But for most cases, the labor in that kitchen is entirely of enslaved people.
So if we have enslaved people doing this work, Janice, how would they be trained?
They're being trained by the elders there on the property, those who are not necessarily old, when we say elder, but someone who's been there long enough to have the wisdom and the know-how, the skill, to show them, to bring them up in the ranks, to teach them that skill as well. You have children on the property. And a lot of times those people are looking ahead because this is an institution that you might grow into and draw your last breath and no release from it. So the more skilled you are, the more valued you are to those that own you, and maybe they can keep you in a place that you're closer to your family or those folks of kin instead of sending you off somewhere else. So it's to your advantage and to your owner's advantage that you're skilled in certain trades. And this cooking is a trade, setting up a table, preparing a dinner, that there's a skill to all of that because it's the execution that adds all the polish to it.
So as different as that is in the 18th century from most homes today, learning these skills is probably not that different from today. We follow our mom and dad around and
it really isn't, because that's how I learned. My mother saw that I would like to be in the kitchen up under her all the time, so she gave me a bowl and a fork and said, here, cream this butter, mash it until I tell you to stop. And then she had me whipping things up, taught me how to whip egg whites, how to scramble eggs, things like that. You know, when I could see over the stove, that's when she put me there. But she also taught me how not to get burned as well. So she's teaching me, even her recipe for making bread, she showed me once. And then she said, the rest is up to you. Now you got to figure out what you want that dough to feel like. You got to know how to test your yeast and know about heat and humidity, all those things to make, not bricks, but a roll that someone can actually sink their teeth into. So it's quite an experience. So that learning went from generation to generation.
We've got some questions coming in from viewers. Latha Faye on YouTube is curious about how many hours would be spent to prepare this main meal for the day, or for those 3 courses. Similarly, they're curious about how much wood would you be burning through. So we talk about dinner starts maybe around 2 o'clock. When are you getting in the kitchen to start to work?
As soon as you can see. As soon as there's enough light to start to function, you'll get your fire started and you'll go to market, because the market determines the menu. If it's not at market, it won't be on the table. So first and foremost, you're going to select from those things that have been brought in for sale and plan your menu at that point, and then everything will go back to the palace, most of it going directly to the scullery, and then the hard work begins.
So we've got a question from Amy. She's wondering, how would you carve a fish like that? But I'll add to her question and say, who would do it and where would it be done? At the table, in the kitchen?
Actually, that fish would probably be placed at either the head or foot of the table, which means either the governor or his wife would be the one who's actually carving and serving it. The key is the governor doesn't want anybody choking on fish bones. So he's got to be able to fillet that fish at the table directly and make sure that he's not getting any bones. And the fish trowel actually helps with that. Because of its shape and the way it's designed, the edges can be used to sort of cut things, and then you can scoop it all up in that trowel and move it to the plate. So it makes it a little bit easier in the serving than trying to do that with a knife and fork, for example.
And the fish trowel is one of those beautiful examples of something that is so ornate and decorative, but all that decoration is also wound into the function. It needs to be perforated, right? And then you work with that. And it kind of gets to a question that Elizabeth has, and particularly about furniture, but I think we can talk about silver as well. She says, I had no idea how much work it took to make a single piece of furniture. How were the designs created to begin with? And how were the techniques to form the creations figured out? So let's take that element of design. Where are the designs coming from?
Well, in this time period, I can speak to the furniture aspects of things. A lot of the designs and the ideas of a drop leaf dining table, they're very English. We are English, after all. The idea of this compressible furniture, but something stylish. You know, it's not just a block of wood for a leg. It's something turned to on the lathe and stylishly done. The finish, even on the piece of furniture. All these are traditions from the English tradition. Virginians are looking to that for sure, to see what their neighbors across the Atlantic are doing, but there is a tendency in Virginian furniture to have their own traditions as well, as do a lot of the other colonies as well.
So what about silver? Is that, first of all, where is most of the silver coming from?
Most of the silver is probably being imported from England. When planters send their tobacco to England and get credit for the value of the tobacco rather than cash in many cases, they'll buy things from England that are literally made of cash, literally made of silver money. And that way be able to bring their capital to America and use it and show it off all at the same time. A lot of designs are coming out of England. The English are printing without copyright laws. The way you make money if you're a designer is you design things, put them in a book, print the book, and sell the book. So in the furniture business, we know people like Applewhite and who's the other one?
Chippendale.
Chippendale, right? They're designing furniture. The Adam brothers in England are designing entire sets of designs for furniture, for moldings on a house, for silverware, all collectively going together. And then the same thing is true for silver, and even engraving designs are being printed and sold here in America. So you'll find that a new book will come out, and suddenly all the engraving designs on pieces are totally different.
Do we see trends in what people are eating, Frank? Is there sort of the cool meal in 1750, but don't serve it in 1770?
Yeah. And one of the biggest things that influences that trend is, believe it or not, politics. When the revolution comes, Americans completely change their eating habits. We start to embrace things like corn, a new world vegetable, becomes patriotic to eat it. We stop drinking tea, for example, because that's very English, and we start to drink chocolate and coffee because those are patriotic American beverages. So you see a real change in diet that comes with the politics of the revolution. But even prior to that, food is fashion. And it changes and goes through styles just like hairdos and clothing and furniture.
So we've got a question sort of following on that from Chicken Feed News. Was fish the most popular protein back then, or would they have eaten a lot of fowl like chicken at the governor's palace?
The governors, and like all good Englishmen, is a beef eater. They call their soldiers beef eaters for a reason. They love roasted beef. That's what the English are famous for. In fact, there's even a song, The Roast Beef of Old England. That's very popular in this time.
So sticking with food for a moment, Doug has a question about, do we know anything about special diets at the time? How much are they thinking of nutrition, and are there rules about, so-and-so can't eat this? Or?
Yes, if you had some sort of ailment and you went to a physician or an apothecary in the 18th century, the very first thing they are going to do is change your diet, because they are aware that the diet influences the health. Now, exactly how they change your diet and what they tell you to eat or not eat will depend on your ailment, and may or may not necessarily relate to curing that problem in modern scientific terms. But from their mind, in the sort of humor system that's still holding on in parts of the 18th century, there is very much a clear connection between your health and your diet.
Yeah, so in the cabinet making video, we saw a leg that our archaeologists unearthed from behind the Anthony Hay cabinet shop. Clearly something somebody made a mistake on, got forgotten about and buried. Visitors many, many times a day, for good reason, are going to ask us in the silversmith shop and in the cabinet shop, what happens when you make a mistake? So is this table perfect?
It is.
I mean, it's pretty darn close, but you know, what happens if something goes a little wrong?
It's pretty good, yeah, and I think that's it. For the most part, you know, what goes wrong is sometimes our fault, and sometimes that just is how the wood was. This particular table has 6 legs, and I can tell you that one of those legs, down at the ankle, right above the foot, is just a little bit narrower than the other ones. It's no secret, and I have a tough time finding it unless I break out a caliper. The idea is that in a pre-industrial world, if it looks good, it is good. And I think George will probably agree with me here. No matter your medium, if the overall effect of the piece, whatever it is aesthetically pleasing, then you got to be pretty happy with that. And I think I am overall. So.
And with silver, do you see anything?
Yeah, I would say, well, I always try to teach my apprentices, and part of it is based on the cabinet making business, is that there's a good side and a bad side. There's a front side and a back side. And I dare say we turn this over, this would not look as nice underneath
Not quite.
as it does on top. And that spoke to who's going to be looking at this, right? If someone is going to be cleaning the inside of it, are you trying to impress that person, you know, with how good it is? But if someone's going to be admiring the outside of it in a formal setting, then that is the person you're trying to impress. That goes to the hierarchy of status and class in the 18th century. So, you know, make the right side. If you've got a bad ingot, you know, that's good on one side and bad on the other, the bad side of the ingot goes on the bottom of the tray. Or the bad side of the ingot goes on the inside of the coffee pot. So the other part is going to look good.
I always remind visitors that if you're under a table, you're probably too young or too drunk to notice, you know, the extra tool marks and so forth. But we think about mistakes happening in a trade shop. It's one thing, and there can be consequences from that, more time and so forth. But Janice, for people serving a meal, how do they avoid making mistakes? What are the consequences of making mistakes?
Well, the person that's overseeing the room, the setup, and how everything's conducted is going to try to make sure that the right people have the right jobs, so to avoid the confusion and the possibility for accidents and incidents to happen. But everybody there is going to know that the image that folks walk away with is the image that you contribute to. So your master and mistress are not going to be happy if at the end of the day they're talking about how badly the sideboard table was set up. You just brought the things in and put them there, but did not arrange them to their best advantage to be presented in the best way to show off their wealth and what they have and their status to complement them. So everybody knows that every little detail adds to the picture. And so everybody's going to be in place and do what they're supposed to, knowing that you might not get credit, but you certainly will get the blame if things don't go the way they want them to, and they can't afford to have that happen.
Yeah, and so Frank, you're also in this position where, you know, what happens? You're cooking an expensive fish and you don't have another one.
You may have to rearrange how you're serving it. You know, you might want to cut it up beforehand so you can hide some of the blemishes or problems, or you may have to find another alternative. Maybe you go grab some crab or something instead. So there's going to have to be something done, because it will be obvious as its appearance on the table is really just as important as in any other field. So the look of that food is really what gets you ready to eat it. And if it doesn't look good, then it doesn't get everybody ready to eat. So that's very important in their table setup.
Right, so we've got a question from Christine, who I think is reminding us to eat our vegetables, basically. But she said, we talk about protein, but what about vegetables? What else would be, you know, out on the table?
Well, there's certainly vegetables, but keep in mind that they are seasonal. So, you know, you have asparagus for about a month in the spring, and then you will not eat asparagus again until the next year when it blooms. So there's very much a seasonality to the diet, and especially to the vegetables. In the wintertime, you have your root vegetables: carrots, potatoes, onions, turnips, cabbages, things that you can store down in the cellar for months on end. But you're not eating a lot of salad in January, or anything fresh and green in that period. In the summer, you'll have plenty of fresh vegetables, but that's also when you need to start preserving those vegetables by pickling them for the wintertime when you won't have them. So anything green that grows in that garden will also be put into vinegar and stored in crocks for use in the wintertime when you don't have the fresh greens for your table. But vegetables are not expensive, so they're not emphasized on the table. They tend to garnish the meats and to be a few sides, but it's not like our setup where we have a meat, a side, and a protein kind of a setup. It's really more like the garnishes of vegetables and vegetable dishes, but the emphasis is on the meat and the sugar rather than the vegetables.
So Daniel is curious about drinks. What would be part of the meal? Is this water, beer, wine, or any other spirits? And then after dinner, are we shifting gears? Or?
Absolutely. At the Governor's Palace, the beverage for the table would be Madeira wine. Madeira is very popular with the English. They like the sweet, fortified, stronger wines, more so than the dry French wines that we prefer today. So there will be Madeira with the meal, and then after the meal is over, what will happen is the ladies will retire to the parlor for tea. While they're drinking their tea in the parlor, the gentlemen in the dining room will start drinking punch, and they'll start toasting. Probably start with the king, maybe work their way down to the local magistrate, and of course with each toast everybody drains their glass, and so the gentlemen are there in the dining room having a real good time, and then the ladies will come back after an hour or so from their tea and start off the evening activities, playing cards, dancing, playing music, what other events you might want to have from there.
This is, again, very different from today, but also similar in that we have rituals that we're sort of following. And then we are equipping ourselves to be capable of doing that in style. But at some point, this all ends. Tina wants to know, how do we clean? How do we clean silver? How do we clean furniture? Is that going to happen right after the meal?
Well, there's a time for everything. And there's a man who was enslaved. His name was Onesimus, who lived in the 1700s. And he actually did leave behind and publish a book that talks about the butler's remembrance. And it's a directory for folks who are going to do those daily activities. If you want to know how to get rid of bed bugs and rats and mice, and how to decanter wine and polish silver, fresh linens, what to do with your fresh linens, how to set up your pantry, all the breakfast, lunch, everything you could think of blackening someone's books is in that booklet. And so when you read it and see all the numbered details, it's amazing to think that these people who are placed below the average person in society are using so much mental intellect and intelligence to do these things. And so there's not too much they don't know how to do, whether it's cleaning the fireplace or getting dust from the hand-carved inlay of the black walnut paneling on the walls, to polishing the silver, polishing the copper, even brushing the clothes, a gentleman's dressing room. It's all there, and you would never think that these people were doing all of what they're actually doing.
Right. I remember learning how to set the table as a kid, and I thought it was really great at first, and then I was like, okay, do I have to? But Nancy wants to know, I don't know which one of you might answer this best, is there a proper way to set the flatware?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and much the same as today. The 18th century fork is very different from our modern fork. There are only 2 times typically on an 18th century fork. The fork started out as a cooking instrument and became a table instrument. And so those tines are actually very sharp, and you want them facing down on the table so that nobody gets stabbed in the process of that. And then so that's very important in that table setup. And then the plates and the glasses and all that and how they're arranged is very much a reflection of the household and the table and the equipment they can put out.
Yeah, well, I think time is flying by here. I think we have time for one final question. And I'll take a question from Doug, but just sort of change it a little bit. Doug particularly asks, would enslaved people ever receive leftovers from their enslavers' tables, or was that line never crossed? But more broadly, these people have been working to serve others. When do they eat? What are they eating? We'll start with you, Janice, but then we'll sort of go around the table. Different people in different positions within Williamsburg. When, what, how are they taking care?
Most enslaved folks, well, it depends on the household and the master and mistress, what they do. Every household is different. Every owner is different. Some might give you some of what's left that they want to discard. But most of the time, that's being saved for the master and mistress, their next meal. But think about the ingenuity of these enslaved folks. They know when their stomachs are empty, and they know when they finally get around to having a meal, they're going to do and take advantage of the waters, as Frank has said. We sit between two rivers. So these people have fish traps that they set into the waters. They take advantage of the seafood in the tributary waterways. They're foraging in the forest. They're also sometimes have given permission having patch gardens. So they're supplementing their meek and meager diets with vegetables, root vegetables that you speak about, and the fish and all those frog legs and deer, squirrel, plenty of those running around. So, and rabbit, they're not starving. They're using their ingenuity, and sometimes with permission or without permission. But they're learning how to set a full table and get a full stomach like everybody else.
Right. And so, John, you're certainly a bit long in the tooth to be an apprentice in the 18th century. But
point, yes.
An apprentice in the 18th century, where are they typically going to take their meal?
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends where they're living. More often than not, apprentices are living on the premises or in the household of the master of the shop. So it might actually be in their indenture, their contract for their apprenticeship, that they are owed food or drink, this and that, the other. Sometimes they're very specific, other times they're not.
Right.
You know, it really does depend. But like other people in employ in the shop, situations vary, like Janice said, from household to household. But sometimes they get very specific on what meat they are supposed to be given daily or weekly and that sort of thing. Yeah. It's always an interesting insight into their lives.
So George, you are on the other end of the trade spectrum as a master of a silversmith shop. I mean, are you doing okay? Can you afford some of your work? Or some of our cabinet making work?
I probably could afford some of my flatware. I doubt if I could have afforded the hollowware.
Right.
You do see someone like Henry Weatherburn across the street from us, who has one of the nicer taverns in town, and he has quite a large collection of silver that he probably uses for entertaining in his, what would you call that?
Private dining room.
Private dining room, yeah. And he has quite a bit of silver, including a large, very heavy silver tea kettle. But because he's not the wealthiest man in Williamsburg, he probably bought that used, and it dates from an earlier style of the century. But someone like James Craig, he himself owned 5 enslaved people, and 2 of them were below the age of 16, and 3 were above the age of 16, and one of them was quite likely a cook. So he probably had most of his meals prepared by enslaved staff at that time.
And so Frank, I mean, for the people working in the kitchen, are they stealing a bite as they go, or are they?
Well, there's a certain necessary amount of tasting that will always occur in the kitchen. You've got to make sure it's right before you send it out. But that's not going to fill your belly. And if things start to disappear on a regular basis, you're going to catch the blame for it. So they're probably very careful about that sort of thing. More than likely at the palace, there would be another meal entirely for servants and enslaved folks going next door in the scullery. Just a giant cast iron pot full of a porridge of some type or another. Grain, a little bit of salted pork, and lots of vegetables. And that really reflects the diet of probably 80% of Virginia at this time period. Heavy whole grain breads, 1-pot stew, meals, stew and bread. That's the staple of the diet for most Virginians. They'll knock that down with water, perhaps beer or cider for the poorer folks, and then the Madeira wines and Roman punches for the wealthy folks.
Well, yeah, there's so much to talk about, and I think that was part of our idea with this program, was to take something that happens regularly and look at it from several different perspectives, pull a few of those strands and see what we uncover. And obviously, we can do that with dinner over and over again and think about so many other aspects. Certainly one part of a good meal is good conversation. And I'm grateful for all of you for joining us here today and for all of you watching along at home. Thanks for your questions and comments. Of course, this program, like so many others, has been made possible through the generosity of our donors. Thank you. If you'd like to learn how you can contribute to what we do here at Colonial Williamsburg, follow the links pinned to the comments below, or simply find us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Frank, I know you and your staff over the years have put many recipes out on Colonial Williamsburg's website. Could you, especially as we approach the holidays, where can people find these recipes?
If you go to Colonial Williamsburg's website at colonialwilliamsburg.org and type recipes or 18th century recipes into the search engine, that'll get you to the page. And we have a rotating 20 or so recipes up there. They'll have meats and sweets and treats in between. So take a look at them. We put up the original 18th century recipe as it was written, and then a modern translation for modern cooks at home. And there's some wonderful things up there as the holidays come. You might find some good holiday dinner ideas on Colonial Williamsburg's website.
Yeah, and so we, again, thank you all for joining us. Come and see us soon. You can find John and Janice and Frank and George in their shops and on their sites ready to answer all your questions. But thanks so much. We'll see you around.